course, chimpanzees won't lay still long enough to be an fMRI machine to allow decent brain imaging. So they've had to find ways to get around that, and they've found some very clever ways to do that. And what they've come up with, without going into the whole research paper, is that, in fact, chimpanzees do not have a language. They don't have a constructed language. You know, they certainly communicate, but they don't build characters together symbolically like we do. So trying to guess what their default mode network is, what happens to them when they are tasking, which for us is blah, 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 what happens for them is probably just symbolic images. There is no blah, blah going on in chimpanzees' mind, as near as we can ascertain with the best experience we can run right now. So our very nearest, almost identical primates to us, chimpanzees, do not have this same kind of blah, blah going on in their mind. It doesn't mean they don't have symbolic images passing through, but they do not have the blah, blah that we do. So this is kind of a human special disease, and we can tell.
The ego.
The ego. This ego that we've created is a human special disease. And it may be because we become so highly socialized. I mean, you will never see two chimpanzees carrying one log. They just do not cooperate that way. They almost never cooperate as a group to do anything large. And no other primates, almost no other animals, make enormous organizational structures to accomplish bigger goals. We're unique in that. A lot of our neurocortex is specialized for socialization issues. So we're uniquely special, maybe uniquely cursed, whatever word you want to use for this, because we have this very active ego going on. And is this a modern disease or not with this ego thing? Well, supposedly, if you go back 500 years ago, we looked at the thoughts per day. I didn't do the study, but 500 years ago, they guessed how many thoughts people were having. About 5,000 thoughts a day. Now, we supposedly have 55,000 thoughts a day. So as our world has gotten more complex, we are thinking a lot more. We are doing a lot more internal processing, a lot more blah blahs going on. So this is somewhat a disease of the modern era. We have so much information coming at us now, so much data coming at us now. Our world is so much massively more complex than what it was before, that we're thinking about all this stuff. And we're doing 55,000 thoughts a day. That surely can't be necessary.
Right, like, for example, I always sort of choked on this idea that there was more information now bombarding us than there was in the past, because if you go to the Amazonian rainforest, you know, there's an enormous amount of information flow in that rainforest. But I think that what's distinctive and has kind of led to this runaway process in part is that we're being bombarded with all of this information now that is directed to us, seemingly directed to us. It's, hey you, hey you, hey you, hey you. Whereas the information gradients in the Amazonian rainforest is kind of differential, right? It's like, it's not about us, right? We can create mythologies where it is about us, but we almost can't escape the mythology that it's about us now. So what's interesting is that if you think about this, you think about another forest or another garden, and you look at the Old Testament, you look at Genesis, a very coherent reading of the Adam and Eve tale and Eve's eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil is precisely this fall story that we're talking about, right? That both the freedom and burden of the emergence of the ability to have an ego that can at least pretend that it's calculating the pluses and minuses of different activities in the world is allegorically represented in the second and third book of Genesis, where what's happening is that a garden is intentionally made for these human beings, and these human beings do what they would do in that garden, which is eat all of the things in the garden. And as a result, we get the gift, right, of awareness. The scales fall from our eyes, or we become aware that we're naked. But then we have to make the next move, right? It's almost like we've been in that part of the drama since the second and third book of Genesis. And we haven't made the next point to look back at where that capacity to make these alleged judgments comes from, when in fact Eve wasn't making the judgment at all. She was supposed to eat the fruit, if you read the book of Genesis. So I think it's really interesting that we've been aware of this problem for a really long time, even if it has probably metastasized in modernity, and that it gets imprinted into our stories that we tell ourselves, because it's kind of unavoidable. We can't, no matter how much we try to dodge the fact of the present moment, and the fact that the present moment offers this fourth state of consciousness that is beyond this egoic calculating state of consciousness, it persists, right? It cannot be defeated, as it were. So, so I feel, in that sense, very optimistic that we can maybe continue this evolutionary move, right, from the chimp, which is kind of in some ways perfectly tuned to its own environment without the egoic rider, pretending to bond over characters. And then we come along and for, how many, 70,000 years, occupy this kind of dream world of imagining each other and being the characters. And now we're at the next phase where we can know that's what we're doing and look back and activate that other part of our consciousness, which is not excluded by the egoic consciousness. However much the egoic consciousness thinks that it can exclude that fourth state of consciousness, it cannot.
Yeah, I think it's important to look at this as the next step of evolution, not a step back to what a chimpanzee has, which is no symbolic consciousness, no blah blah going on, as we can tell. So the question is, do we already de-evolving? Are we taking a Copernican demotion to move back to a chimpanzee mind? Or are we trying to take the next step ahead? I think the argument is we're making the next step ahead, that we want to be able to use symbolic consciousness to problem solve, plan, etc. That appears to be unimpeded, even as we shut down largely this self-famous blah blah network that's very good focused. So I think the idea is we can move forward, and I think we're at a tipping point. I mean, if you look around, things are not going very well right now, and I do think our time span to do something about it is finite and not long. So I think we need something like recognizing the Earth is not the center of the universe and that the Earth is not flat, some kind of a change in our ego construction so we can live responsibly in this world with each other, act more humanely, share better, all the things we don't do well now because we have this overactive ego now with 55,000 thoughts a day. How can we get coherent policy out of somebody whose mind's running 55,000 thoughts a day?
And probably more.
Probably
average policy analyst is probably 150,000.
But artificial intelligence that does ethics, that's where I think we're going, honestly.
Well, I mean, that's if we're going to abrogate our responsibility, but they'll still leave us behind, though, with then maybe 70,000 thoughts a day and completely miserable. So it's, can we evolve ourselves? And this is, as Mark knows very well, better than I do, we're just an eye blink evolutionarily. Now we're talking, Twitter's been on 5 years and Facebook 8 years, whatever it is we use, but very short time frame. Against millions of years of evolution, 70,000 of symbolic consciousness, we've got to be very perceptive and very proactive in doing something, or we're going to run out of resources, we're going to run out of life. It's going to be a nasty place. I think we have to somehow recognize this is a critical time. We have to do something.
Well, and one of the ways that can, again, I keep returning to this idea of a runaway process. One of the ways that runaway process can be instigated is that the very thing that we all appear to be chasing, as globalization takes more and more people into the orbit of consumer capitalism and modernity, is right here in us. And it's been wrapped in religious garb. It's been wrapped in a kind of spiritual message. But I think there's a way of understanding it is that we, all of us, have this kind of bliss as our birthright, in fact. And that while it was useful in an evolutionary sense to chase it for a while, it's long since outstripped its usefulness in terms of, chasing more and more goods and services that get distributed over the planet, even as there's 2 billion of us that we don't really pay any attention to and don't have electricity, don't have water, and so forth. So, I feel optimistic because that bliss is a very powerful input into the system. So even if we have a finite period of time, which I obviously agree with, and even if we're facing some version of total planetary distress, we have very powerful technology in that fight, and that technology is it just happens to be within us.
But just imagine a world without an ego. Just imagine if nobody had the egoic consciousnesses that we do now. You think, well, I would behave very badly. I would go do awful things if I didn't have an ego protecting me. I wouldn't have blah, blah helping me.
I would cut in line at the McDonald's.
Yes, exactly. But in fact, you don't cut in line at McDonald's without an ego.
No, because I'm enjoying my bliss.
But you actually behave better.
Yeah.
There's no record demonstrating the fact that if you lose thoughts, you suddenly become some awful person. It doesn't happen. You are very heavily conditioned. You've had genetics. You've had epigenetics. You've had cultural conditioning. You've had friends around you. A lot of experiences. You're not going to suddenly run upstairs and throw out your chair through the window. It just doesn't happen. You're just not going to behave that way. It just never occurs. So you just overestimate how important this egoic consciousness is to keeping your behavior in check. It doesn't keep it in check. It's what causes all the problems.
Rather like we overestimate the role of nation states in creating order in human societies, is that we think, oh, what would we do without a nation state in order to make sure that we all didn't destroy ourselves? Yeah. But in fact, the problem is within each of us, and the solution is within each of us.
Well, that's one pet peeves of religion. And we believe religions are here to keep us to behave morally, and to behave in a respectful and peaceful and loving way. And yet, pick up, log on. I mean, it's absolutely not the case. And it's not just one particular religion. It's many, maybe all religions got the same problem. And they really do not free us to be open to whatever our truth is ourselves. They want to give us a story. They want to give us a protocol. And in fact, you've already got the protocol installed in you right now. You don't need anybody's help for this.
And ironically, each one of them contains within them the story of that.
At the very top, at the beginning.
Yeah,
at the very beginning. That's right.
Every single one of them points to this fourth state of consciousness as being something that's available to each and every one of us.
It gets processed down through 2,000 or 1,500 or 500 or 2,500 years. And there's a lot of massaging goes on, and a lot of people involved, invested in this thing, working their way off.
Let me just make a little bit of money off of that.
Just a little bit, yeah. And so you've got to find a way to set people free. And this is really about personal freedom, absolute personal freedom. You can be free of that institutional constraint. You can be free of your ego. There's a whole different you there that's just ready to go. You can just get out of the way.
Reminds me of what the Dalai Lama had posted on his Facebook page 2 weeks ago.
Even the Dalai Lama got a dopamine hit.
Exactly. Because he got so many likes.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, he said that a religion at this point, he's finally come to the conclusion that religion cannot be the source for dealing with our ethical issues at this point, that we need to find another way for engaging ethics. I mean, I personally have felt this way for a very long time, but that ultimately religion's place is to tell its own history, to tell its own story, and it isn't to create and adapt to new futures in that sense. And that's one of the biggest, I think, problems and limitations to most religious arcs in that sense. It's helped groups together, but when we see this as part of a global playing field amongst other epistemological sort of constraints and other things like science and other politics and policy making and decision making, it's not a very robust system for helping deal with adaptation. So what we need to do is generate, and I think begin to develop, an ethical framework or a way for understanding ethics that sort of transcend the ego in that sense of individuals, but also try to transcend the ego of institutions, which is, I think, the difficult part, the ego of the nation state. So how would we transcend the ego of institutions, I think, is one of the big problems.
Well, to me, I could do it virally. Mm-hmm. I mean, what we're talking about now is if you just begin deconstructing the ego, then you deconstruct the need for religion, for an institution telling me what to do, because I find out that, in fact, I know what to do. I mean, if I just get blah, blah out of the way, I'm not constructing an imaginary future. I'm just living right now. I chopped wood and carried water before. I chop wood and carry water now. You just aren't up here when you're chopping wood and carrying water. And I think if we can just begin to deconstruct it, look how hard the churches fought against recognizing the earth wasn't the center of the universe. When people had hot pokers jammed through their tongues before they were burned to death because they wouldn't recant on that very simple thing that the earth's the center of the universe. It's ridiculous. But that's what they live for, is to preserve these obscure beliefs, these absolutely unquestionable, just believe this. And it's not true. It's ridiculous.
Well, and I think Eric had a good point there, though, in the sense that I liked how you put it, because religions exist in order to tell the story of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And in that sense, they're like self-replicating discourses. And we can actually give thanks to them for that, right? Like the Dalai Lama, much of Buddhist Dharma wouldn't exist if Tibet hadn't been telling the story of Buddhism to itself for the past 1,500 years.
Mm-hmm.
But, as the Dalai Lama seems to himself recognize, that's not what it's about anymore. Okay, it's like, thank you for preserving that, and we can actually, I personally think, learn a lot from those stories about how to activate our fourth state of consciousness, how to deactivate our egoic state of consciousness, because that's part of the story they've been telling about themselves. But they neither have a monopoly on that, nor are they necessary and sufficient to that. So what's going to be interesting is there a way for us to transition to a kind of society that is post-religious but intensely sacred? If I can...
well, it's spiritual versus religious. Yeah. And I think that's what we're questioning. I mean, I don't see any proclivity on the part of the churches to disempower themselves.
No.
I mean, on the contrary, they're trying to maintain their power at all costs, and despite very bad behaviors in many of the churches. So you say, well, okay, what value do religions have now today? This is not neo atheism.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not New Advaita speaking. This is like saying, let's be spiritual. Let's not be religious. I mean, religious to me is the very antithesis of what spirituality is about. I mean, you've structured something that was alive and now made it dead, and something that's we're fighting to preserve.
One of the greatest hoaxes in history, right? Like something that we have to do ourselves gradually gets outsourced to somebody else. And I think that's really the kernel of the message, is that there's nobody to do it but each and every one of us together. And, as a friend of mine says, there's nothing to it but to do it. Yeah. It's not difficult. It doesn't require special initiation.
We have disempowered people.
Yeah.
Our institutions have taken our power away from us. They've told us, you can't do it yourself. You aren't capable of this. We have to tell you what to do. And in fact, that's not the case, not in this field.
And that's what makes this Dalai Lama example a beautiful one, actually. It's like you actually have a person who is a part of a previously theocratic society saying, can't work.
Meditative practice may be unique in that way, in that, at least in many of the versions of it we find even today, it's put back on the person directly.
Mm-hmm.
And, when you recognize that, when you stop thinking, you can see the absurdity of all of the, the conventions and the trappings of institutions.
Yeah.
The dogmatic communications are lost if you make the person look for themselves.
Yet there's always another level of initiation or, achievement that is there within all of these beautiful traditions, that is there to, in some sense, tempt us almost. And saying, well, it's true that all I have to do is turn off my mind and dwell in and watch my own thoughts. But, maybe if I got the Kala Chakra initiation, that would really be the thing. And that's what's kind of interesting about it, is that it's a little bit like the difficulty of a relationship that I talked about before, that it's actually a great gift. Because it's there to make us work through whatever it is we have to work through. And in this case, it feels like those initiations, those levels of achievement and so forth that many of our religious institutions are fond of and work off of, are there to challenge us to let go of our need for any kind of external verification of our experience whatsoever.
But that's how, and we're tuned that way as humans. I mean, it's very important to me if the person above me in the hierarchy accepts me and rewards me and promotes me and everything else. And so you watch not just Buddhism, but all religions. They have structure in them. I mean, there are sects within, like all religions, that don't do this. But everybody else has a graded scale. And not surprisingly, the graded scale costs money. It costs performance. It costs, dedication to the cause. That's how you earn your way up the ladder.
The stairway to heaven.
The stairway to heaven, and that's what got Martin Luther come out of the Catholic Church, of course. The whole selling of indulgences. You could buy your way into purgatory. You could get Uncle Fred out of purgatory. You could do it all, and I think that's the very nature of who we are as an evolutionarily derived entity, is that we have this structural hierarchical thing in us, and if somebody can come in and say, look, I'm alpha, I'm higher up this hierarchy than what you are, and I can say you're kind of okay, I can move you up 2 levels.
Thank you very much.
Then we're programmed to respond to that,
Yes.
and we do. And so, not just religions, but all organizations have learned this. In fact, you can be a faculty member, you can be a level 1, a level 2, a level 3, a level 4, a level 5,
liberal arts research professor.
Yeah, exactly. But there's even in our university, there's so many hierarchical levels that you can get into. Many of them. And organizations have learned this about us, how we operate, and they can give away a badge of promotion that's worth a lot of money. We'll trade a lot for being called this as opposed to being called that.
Actually, I have a title that is actually worth no money at all. It's just a title as liberal arts research professor.
Isn't it beautiful?
And so they've perfected it totally that it doesn't actually have to mean anything at all.
It means nothing.
It's like those coats of arms that you can get if you go to Ireland and you happen to have something remotely like an Irish. It's like, oh, here's your coat of arms, and you still get the dopamine shot.
Yeah, that was when I was in the organizations. That's what you did for a living. That's what we did. You can be third assistant vice president.
Senior executive vice president of operations.
And so what happens, I've suggested demoting the ego, but not demoting it. You just say, well, you're going to be second, third assistant in charge of something or other later. We're going to promote you later. But now you're not going to be in charge of the place anymore.
In fact, nobody's in charge.
Nobody's in charge, and you aren't going to be in charge. You'll have a job, and here's your title. A long title, and they can go off and do that job. But I think, we watch it in ourselves, how we get caught up in promotions and titles, and how much people will fight for this much difference in status in large organizations. It's feeding off of how we were derived evolutionarily.